Welcome back. We are so excited to have our special guest with us today. We were just talking about some very fascinating tea right before we started recording. So we are so excited to have her here. You may recognize her if you were at our APT happy hour. She joined us then. So thank you, Anna Blake, so much for joining us today. We're just so glad that you're here.
Hi, thank you so much for having me.
So we actually kind of met because we started interacting on TikTok. So you're one of our new internet art history friends, which is so exciting to meet people who think about the same things that we do on the internet. The internet is good for something. And your TikTok, you have such good art history conversations on the app, and I just love your TikTok. I'm obsessed with it. So a lot of what we are going to get into today stems from conversations that you're having and sharing with people on the app. So can you start by kind of walking us through the goal of your platform and why you feel that these conversations are important to bring to people's attention?
Sure, yeah. Well, yeah, so thank you for having me. Um, it is kind of insane how like wonderful and close like this art history community on TikTok is. I
Yeah.
did not expect that at all when I joined the app. So that's incredible. But yeah, regarding my platform, when I talk to people about what I do for a living, I am an independent arts writer. That's kind of what I was before the pandemic and all through the pandemic. I'm an independent arts writer. And so when I tell them that, you know, there's like a variety of reactions, but more often than not, people say that they're not smart enough to understand art, which makes me really sad. So I wanted to build a space where there wasn't any intimidation. There wasn't, and you know, it demystifies art appreciation, because I think a lot of people who maybe are just not familiar. I mean, even I will get nervous still going into a museum
Oh, yeah.
and like feeling like eyes are on me, and like I'm not like walking through the space the right way or something like that. Like there's so much anxiety around it. So I want to demystify it. I want people to know they're capable of understanding art at a high level, because I never thought that I could. But it's absolutely possible. It's easier than you think. So I feel like having an understanding, but more importantly, feeling like your understanding of art is valid is extremely important and makes an art encounter so much more enriching. So that's why I started my account.
Yeah, that's amazing. And to your point about just you as an art historian and someone who's so involved in the art world, like even you having anxiety going into a museum, I feel that too. I feel like sometimes I'm like worried that I'm not like lingering enough at a piece, or that I'm not reading enough of the information that's available, or if I'm not like taking into account like everything that the, you know, curatorial process has presented me with. And then, you know, if people ask you questions because they think you are like this expert and you don't know, it's very awkward. It's just, it makes you feel so uncomfortable, even for people who are supposed to like be part of this realm.
Yeah. And like I like to take a picture of the work and then take a picture of the label for
Yes.
later. And then I get self-conscious because I think people are judging me. They're like, "Oh, she's just here for social media," or something like that.
Yes.
Oh my gosh,
Yes.
yes. That's such a big like fear, because it's like I'm a person that, yeah, I'm also like social media thirsty sometime, but I love going to museums and like I want to show that off. But then like Bianca and I, you know, we'll swap turns like taking pictures of each other like we did, you know, when we went to go see the dinner party, for example. I actually really care about what's going on here. That's just like one of the things, like you think that people like care about you so much, and like they don't. Like people could care less about me, but it's still that intimidation in your head.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's such a weird thing. But that's amazing. The demystification of the arts is just, it's so important, and it's so part of what Gianna and I are interested in. So we've started to have more productive conversations on the podcast about cancel culture. We're kind of talking about this with our interview with Nebula and Whooper. So how does this translate to the visual arts? You made a TikTok about things never to say to an art historian, one being we need to, quote, separate the art from the artist. And we've kind of talked about this in different moments on the podcast, but this concept is really going to help guide our conversation for today. Before we get into kind of specific artists like Picasso, for example. So will you share your thoughts on equally accounting for the history and the actions of artists as well as their physical work, and why that's important to the art historical canon?
Yeah. So a lot, like a staggering amount of male artists throughout history abused and objectified their quote unquote muses. And a lot of the times these were women who were artists themselves, who maybe didn't feel like it was okay for them to say no to these men. Picasso is the most famous example of this, and we'll get more into it later. Paul Gauguin is another well-known example. Both of these men inflicted real irreversible harm and trauma on women and young girls who sat for them. And that doesn't even begin to scratch the surface on cultural appropriation and racism in art history. So I don't think people understand how much damage these artists really did. We say, oh, Picasso was a misogynist. Well, I mean, so is like every other man in the world. So I, so it isn't really, I don't think that people understand just the depth of how far that damage goes. I would like to go deeper to kind of fully more understand kind of just what I've heard and read about, like not circumstance, like anecdotally, because a lot of it's just like anecdotes of like, I would like to go deeper, but what I have found is like pretty upsetting, and so a lot of the time you have to just say, I don't want to read about this anymore. I know enough to know that this is not okay. The information's out there if you're interested. It's not hard to find, but there is, like, if you are sensitive to descriptions of sexual abuse or intimate partner violence, I do not recommend looking that up on your own. I don't expect every artist ever to be a saint. No one does. It's not realistic, but when an artist's abuse of power is directly manifested in their work in the way that it is famously with Picasso or Gauguin, the separating the art from the artist argument, it just starts to fall through, because you're looking at a woman who was coerced or did not consent to be there, especially in Gauguin's case. So when we start to argue about whether or not we should ignore an artist's wrongdoings because they were talented or a genius or whatever, it continues to perpetuate this idea that you can be untouchable, or you can act without punishment as long as you're good at what you do. And that's why people today, like Donald Trump and Harvey Weinstein and any other number of men, are able to get away with what they have. I mean, Harvey Weinstein is starting to get some, those women are starting to get justice, but for a long time he was untouchable. And that's why people like Brock Turner, when he raped someone, got a lighter sentence, because he was a good swimmer. So it's irresponsible to make that argument.
A really good analogy, the Brock Turner, because it puts something contemporary in perspective, that you can't justify his potential career as a swimmer with you can't conflate the two circumstances. And I think that's a really great contemporary example to point to for people who are confused about this argument. Do you think it's ever possible to separate the art from the artist? Like Gauguin and Picasso, I don't want to call them extreme examples because I don't know, like they're on that kind of like Weinstein Trump level, but do you think there are some artists who have just made mistakes? I mean, like you said, we're human, we're all human, and we make mistakes. Do you think it's possible in other cases for that argument to be presented, or would you like to kind of reframe and restructure this phrase of separation?
No, I think it's certainly possible. Right. There's a gray area. It's nuanced. There are absolutely artists, and right now, like any examples I can't think of, but I know that if we think about it, there are absolutely artists who have made mistakes. And I think it's probably easier today for us to forgive an art, like a contemporary artist, because they are with us and they may make a mistake and they may apologize for it. Yeah, it's absolutely, there are absolutely cases where, you know, we can forgive an artist for what they've done. But in these extreme cases, it's just not possible.
Yeah. To your point, Anna, also, I think, you know, just coming from my own conception of that artwork as well, it makes it very difficult when not only, you know, we see these problematic artists, you know, and their work being presented in this way and kind of getting away with it, but the other aspect that is really hard is how that is celebrated. And that makes, you know, for example, our consumption of that artwork really uncomfortable when we feel like it can be so hard to talk about it and to look at it and like acknowledge it when, you know, other people are just out here celebrating it and using the term Picasso in like an endearing way. So it's also, I think, the other side of not just the artist, but also the ways in which we consume that and celebrate that as well. But on, as Bianca said, one of the reasons why we wanted to have you on the pod was because you are part of our art history TikTok family. Your one TikTok about Picasso actually went viral. And as soon as that happened, Bianca and I were like, we've got to get Anna on the pod. In your video, in your TikTok, your text read, Picasso was a misogynist creep and we should hold him accountable. So you use the trend, yes, of pretending like you were holding hands with your other self. And the two people represent feminists and fascists. And they are in this consensus that Picasso is, quote, overrated. And there was a lot of confusion from people on the app not understanding like where the common thread was between these two parties who typically don't see eye to eye on things. So although we understand the humor and the kind of scholarly thinking at play here, I would like you to walk us through your thoughts and like the process of what it was like to make that video and also the reaction when that post stimulated so much debate and conversation on this particular history of this figure Picasso.
Yeah, it was truly the like most niche thing that you could ever do, and all of these people saw it. But you know, that sound was a meme for a very long time, and I was like, you know, scrolling through my For You page and trying to think of what are other, like, how can I relate this to like my niche and all, and you know, it just made sense. But so to explain it, it's pretty common now, and we'll explain this a little bit more later, but it's pretty common now for contemporary fascist movements to follow in the Nazi Party's footsteps, claiming that modern art, or like they call it like abstract art, is useless, pretentious, meaningless, etc. In the United States, we got really close to having that codified when our last president tried to ban modern design from all federal buildings. I think it was, I can't remember what it was called. It was a ridiculous executive order. It never got signed, but in the United States, white supremacists, at least here, I don't know about globally, but in the United States, white supremacists and the alt-right, because they do overlap, they like to trace their heritage to classical antiquity. I don't know if any of y'all have ever been to the Parthenon replica in Nashville, but they have like a rally out there, like claiming it as their heritage. You know, so for them, like classical antiquity is like peak culture, and I suppose they feel like modern art is an insult to that heritage. And if you try to make logic or reason out of it, it starts to fall apart, but that is what they think. So the TikTok was a joke about how feminists and fascists, these two groups that do not overlap at all in the slightest, may have more in common than we think, though for completely different reasons. Feminists like myself take issue with Picasso's history of sexual assault and cultural appropriation, while fascists just simply cannot appreciate the work. I found it interesting that a lot of the commenters latched onto the verbiage, "We should hold him accountable."
Right.
And kind of seemed to jump to this conclusion immediately that I was trying to cancel Picasso, which is a valid thing to do, but people respond very intensely to that. So it became pretty clear quickly. A lot of people saw this and had maybe never, this went far beyond my usual audience of people who very routinely have art encounters. This went to an audience of people who had never been confronted with any true criticism of what they would consider a genius artist, which is not, it's not a criticism on them, but rather a failure on the institution, broadly institution with a capital I, as an authority that should be encouraging critical thinking in addition to these art encounters.
Yeah. Going off of that, just a follow-up question. So you were talking about all that feedback and those comments that you got on your TikTok, and I did scroll through the comments, which is not
were wild.
Yeah, we're wild. And it's not something I typically do, but I also just wanted to acknowledge the fact that I think the ways in which you were communicating and responding to people was so clear and kind. And the fact that like you took the time to follow up with people about that, I just like wanted to acknowledge that you handled that really lovely. But it's in the comments where you do mention dismantling the idea of the genius artist. So I wanted you to just kind of go in a little bit now and elaborate on that destructive theory and how it has let particularly famous male artists continue to be put up on this pedestal.
Yeah. So in terms of like the art historical canon, Western art history was until very recently made up of male authorities who affirmed other men. I mean, and that's not surprising, right? Like in job interviews, people tend to hire people who remind them of themselves. That is a proven fact. So it makes sense. So the artists who achieved success or fame were artists who sold their work to wealthy patrons, lived in major metropolitan areas like Paris or New York City, and caught the attention of critics like Clement Greenberg and Henry Geldzeller, I'm sorry. And so it was, and as I'm sure that we can all agree, still is in some ways a boys' club, where, you know, popularity rather than merit will determine if someone gets into Jansen's history of art, which will go on to teach further generations and just continue to perpetuate the canon. So these genius artists then were simply men with connections and social capital, and you don't really have to dig too deep to find dozens of other artists who were making similar works at the same time as them without recognition. So we treat the canon like it's a straight line where this movement comes after this movement comes after this movement, and these were the champions of that movement. But we really need to understand that not even the canon, because it's just forget about the canon. We need to understand that art history is a polylogue where there are hundreds of different conversations happening simultaneously. It's not a straight line. It's just not.
I was having a kind of a similar conversation with someone a few weeks ago about music, and I often need a lot of time to kind of sit and think about something for a while before I have like the proper words to kind of articulate how my brain is feeling about it. But what you're describing, I feel is kind of like of a similar case just to music and the conversation that I was recently having about how like this artist did this first and this artist, you know, is repeating the work that they're doing. And I feel like it's so hard when you're taught in art history or in music, like exactly one thing comes right after the other and it's just a straight timeline, and it's completely possible for ideas to pop up sporadically and for the same kind of inspiration to come to multiple people at a different time, just based on the way that our world works. Like we are constantly intaking, and especially with contemporary art and music, the same types of images and people and conversations, and it's not completely unheard of that two people will have a similar idea at the same time, but because of privilege and status and location and all these kind, you know, race, gender, all of these different intersections, one person gets bumped to the top. And so I love that illustration that you're bringing to us, that everything is kind of happening at the same time, and it's kind of a unfortunate, I don't want to call it luck of the draw, but situation of circumstances that people get privileged opportunities to the status of genius artist.
Yeah, and just like a little bit more to that, it's like a really great example of that is, and I understand why art history would be like, this comes after the other, because that's very easy to understand. That's how MoMA became so popular, because they really tried to create that history. But like an example of, you know, all of these different conversations happening at the same time, we regard Paris as kind of where modernism was born. That's where modern art started. But if you look at Gee's Bend, Alabama, you have very similar aesthetics happening in these quilts that were made by women who were descendants of formerly enslaved people. But because of their race, their gender, and where they lived, they absolutely did not get the same attention from critics, because they were doing what was considered a craft and not an art. They were not validated at all, even, you know, by the art world. So it's just so important to remember that there's so many different conversations happening at the same time.
I'm going to say that, Gianna, you also worked on the McVicker show, if I'm thinking correctly. And at our previous art museum, there was this show where we were kind of thinking about centering the Midwest, and how, like you pointed out, just circumstance of location, New York being this quote unquote hub for the art worlds, kind of doesn't lend opportunity to people who are working in the central US. And so Gianna, you worked on that show with
Louise Siddons, who was the curator for that exhibition and wrote an entire book about McVicker, who was an OSU professor. But that exhibition was just really critical. And we also showcased other works of contemporary art. But the fact that people didn't think modernism and modern art didn't exist in, you know, the middle of the country and in the Midwest, which it absolutely did. And that's why we do get, you know, these stereotypes about rural areas, especially in the area that we're at. So yeah.
So the TikTok that we were talking about had about 13,000 views last time I checked. I don't know if it's gone up. With, again, like Gianna said, a lot of the conversation taking place in the comments. And you ended up posting 2 follow-up videos explaining the irony behind your video, and also the irony and controversy that occurred, because surely, you know, we thought we would all be on the same page about this. And in one of your recent videos, you replied to a comment and made sure to note that you understood how this humor can be pretty jarring. But the most ironic thing is that the follow-up post only had about 400 views as opposed to 13,000. So, you know, the TikTok algorithm like still doesn't make any sense to me. But I want to talk about the pivotal art exhibition, which this topic and humor is kind of centered upon. Oh, Gianna, I'm so sorry. You wrote this question and I suck at German.
I also cannot speak German. I just call it the Degenerate Art Show, because that is the English translation.
The Degenerate Art Show. Okay, my German is not good.
yeah, I'm not even going to try.
Okay, perfect. I'm gonna reread.
We all need to work on our German. We're the worst art historians.
Truly,
ever.
And like it's so annoying, because like art history stems from German, you know, theory.
I know, my advisor in grad school was like fluent in German, like wrote scholarly papers in English and German. I'm like, oh
no, French, Italian, we're fine.
Better than me.
Okay, to repeat.
Yes.
So the TikTok algorithm can be pretty frustrating and still doesn't make any sense. But I wanted to talk about the pivotal art exhibition in which this topic and humor was centered upon, the Degenerate Art Exhibition, as called by the Nazi Party.
Hi, I am very sorry. I understand how that can be very jarring. So let me explain. This is not universal among all fascist movements, but it is very common. So when we look at early 20th century Europe, specifically post-World War I Europe, we see a huge wave of avant-garde movement towards modern art. And a lot of this modern art had deeper meanings and forced the viewer to think and question things. So maybe because Hitler was a failed artist himself, he really hated modern art. So the Nazi Party collected a ton of it and they called it Degenerate Art. They put on this huge exhibition that was supposed to be like a, don't do this is bad art. But it was full of famous modern artists and it was hugely successful for opposite reasons than what the Nazis intended. To this day, it is the most attended single art exhibition of all time. Yeah. Yeah, I don't understand the algorithm either. Yeah, so I am a very petty person. And because of that, this is one of my favorite stories from our history. It's my favorite story to tell at parties. Which I guess makes it pretty fun. I don't know. I mean, truly, this is like what drew me towards modern art when I was in grad school. Spark notes. In the 1930s, the Nazi Party, I should not be laughing. In the 1930s, the Nazi Party collected modern art, which was at the time contemporary, and they called it Degenerate Art. They put on an exhibition claiming that the art lacked technical skill, insulted the German feeling, which is like whatever that means. That was like probably like an anti-Semitic dog whistle. It wasn't just work made by Jewish artists that they included, but many of it was. They also included artists who did not live in Germany, like Picasso and like Kandinsky. So what they didn't like was that modern art is probably, or like they thought that modern art was a bit deeper than representational art. It's more than what meets the eye. A lot of modern artists were disillusioned after World War I. That's how we got Dada. And so this European avant-garde was creating work that was making people think probably a bit more than representational art was at the time. Obviously, that's not a blanket statement. Obviously, representational art can be very deep, but that is the gist of what they felt. So they put on the show with slogans that emphasized how bad the artwork was. You can look up pictures. LACMA did a forensic reproduction a few years ago. So there are plenty of photographs of what this would have looked like. It was essentially, this is what bad art looks like. Don't do this. But it had this blockbuster list of artists. It had Kandinsky, Mark Chagall, Otto Dix, Picasso, like so many great, I use the word, but so many modern artists. But you know what I mean. Very famous and popular modern artist. And so for a lot of the people living in Munich, where this was, it did tour, but when it was initially exhibited, it was in Munich. This was their first and possibly only chance to see all of these artists all together at one time. And so to this day, it is the single most attended art exhibition. It averaged about 20,000 visitors a day. And hilariously, they had another show at the same time, concurrently, just like a very close by, called the Great German Art Show, and it was a flop. It was horrible. It was all genre art. Hitler apparently hated it. So it's this great example of a massive failure in fascist propaganda. And it is it illustrates why fascist movements today don't like modern art either.
Wow. I think that's also just in general, it's an interesting example to give when presenting the idea of abstraction, like what that means to like a new learner, because we still, I think abstract art has that, mysticism to it. Like, why I can do that? Like, what does this mean? I don't understand. But that's just, why people are so scared of abstract art, and why fascism was so scared about abstract art, was because of that implementation of emotion and reaction and ethos to a work of art that you're not going to get with like a landscape. But it's funny that the other one flopped. If it was like German expressionism art, which is not my favorite.
Yeah, well, and what's interesting is that when that show like did open, people in the United States, there was a critic in the United States that said, yeah, you know what, I could probably agree with Hitler on some of this, like, because a lot of people really did not like modernism when it first started. People thought abstract expressionism especially, but that's like 20 years down the line. But they hated it when it came out. So
It's kind of interesting. It's definitely not the same, and I don't want to give the appearance that I'm merging the two, but it's interesting just thinking about exhibitions of the refused, or thinking about the Salon de Refusés that took place in the Impressionist era, and thinking about how that show was actually, more popular than the original Salon. So thinking about this idea of something being refused and the idea of kind of general popularity, how that in turn informs art history and how we think about art history as well. Just what is popular, what people show up to, and what people like, that in itself also perpetuates a stereotype about what art gets populated and the value of it, and so on and so forth. So we actually get a lot of questions about Picasso specifically. And we get a lot of inquiries about why we kind of joke about hating him and others like him on the podcast. So can you talk about Picasso specifically? And I know you've talked about this on your TikTok as well, but really elaborate for our listeners some more on like what he did that was so terrible. Because I think that that is so disassociated from our education on the artist and why we use him in kind of our regular terminology. And again, you've talked about the problem of kind of separating him from his work, but is there anything that you would want to say to people who genuinely like his work and see some of his work? I mean, I'm thinking about like Guernica, like how do you have that conversation with people who really feel like one of his pieces or something like that does influence them, and they do want to like it, but they're struggling with what they think about this piece with who he is?
Yeah, I mean, there are Picasso pieces that I like as well. I think that his little smiley faces are very cute. But I think that when you look at a piece, you have to, when you look at specifically a piece by him, you have to understand, you have to know what damage was done to create that piece. So content warning, sexual assault, intimate partner violence, pedophilia is going to all be like after this now. So he had a thing for women who were far younger than him. And he used his lovers, whether they were wives or mistresses, as his models and muses. Olga Koklova, I don't know if I'm pronouncing these names right, but Olga Koklova, Fernand Olivier, Marie-Therese Walter, Francois Guillot, and Dora Maar were their names. Walter was, I think, the youngest when he got involved with her. She was 17. His granddaughter, Marina, wrote in her memoir that, quote, he submitted them to his animal sexuality, tamed them, bewitched them, ingested them, and crushed them onto his canvas. After he had spent many nights extracting their essence, once they were bled dry, he would dispose of them. So that's very alarming. And his granddaughter wrote that. He is known to have physically abused the women in his life. He obviously had a lot of power over these women as a man, as an older man, and because many of them were artists themselves, as a more established person in his career, being on his bad side would have affected these women's careers. He did threaten, I believe it was Francois Guillot, he did threaten, like, if you leave me, you will never work in this town again. That is a paraphrase. He knew that he had power over these people, and he abused it. He abused them sexually, he abused them mentally, and he abused them physically. I think the most troubling account that no one really talks about, this is really only cited in one biography of his, but in 1907, him and his wife, Fernand, they adopted a 13-year-old girl named Raymond. Within the same year, Fernand found explicit drawings that Picasso had done of Raymond nude, a 13-year-old child. Rather than hold Picasso accountable, they sent Raymond back to the orphanage. Absolutely no one talks about this. I see timelines all the time of Picasso, and they mention in 1907, he adopted a girl named Raymond, and then they never speak about it again. It's possible that those drawings were studies for Les Demoiselles d'Avignon, but we don't know for sure. So to anyone who is, you know, a big Picasso fan, I'm not trying to shame, like I don't want you to feel ashamed, because really Western society has trained you to, you know, be a Picasso fan, if that's maybe the correct verbiage. I would just encourage you to look at these and realize that a lot of the people that he drew, a lot of his models, were deeply damaged by what he did to them. I think at least one of them committed suicide. And maybe that wasn't directly because of what he did to them, but I'm sure that the trauma that he inflicted on them probably contributed. So it's just a context that you just have to know.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Ugh, this is awful.
I think kind of moving forward with context is key. And when it comes to something like cancel culture, I wanted to ask, like, what was one of the last things that you really wanted to like help people understand when it comes to that idea of cancel culture within art and like separating the art from the artists? How would you help people to move forward with these ideas, and what do you want to ask them, you know, when they talk about art and visit these art spaces? Because like you said, we don't want people to feel shame for not understanding information that also wasn't accessible in the art place. But how can we especially help have these difficult conversations within a physical, you know, art space itself?
First, there needs to be an understanding of the difference between canceling and holding someone accountable. Canceling is a very valid way of exerting personal power over a problematic figure by refusing to consume their content or interact with them any further. It's a radical form of resistance that started among Black Americans during the Civil Rights Movement. But unfortunately today, canceling doesn't do enough to hold people responsible. Like Louis C.K., he's still working, he's still rich, he's still doing sold out shows. Well, probably not in the past year, but you know, Louis C.K. was supposedly canceled, but he's still working. So that is where accountability comes in. And in terms of art history, the question becomes, and the question that I got a lot on that TikTok, how do you hold a dead person accountable? And that responsibility lies in the institution, with a capital I, the museum specifically. The curator in this instance is someone who has a lot of responsibility and needs to claim that responsibility. They can choose to hang an exhibition on, say, Paul Gauguin, and only use it to advance the narrative of primitivism, which is problematic on its own, the Pont-Aven school, or the genius artist myth. Or they can hang the show and contextualize the work. Who were the women that he painted? How old were they? What was his relationship with them? Why was he so drawn to them? And when we answer those questions, the answers are troubling, but they're extremely important, and that helps us contextualize and understand the work. That doesn't mean that we can't appreciate it, but we have to know what was happening behind the scenes. So an example for moving forward, I want to present an example from the Speed Art Museum, which is the largest art museum where I live in Louisville, Kentucky. In 1972, the museum purchased a John Cassare painting. It's called Light Purple Panties Zippered Slip from 1971. You can look it up. It's confrontational. And when the museum purchased it, it was purchased with the intention to be provocative, revolutionary piece to be in a museum and collection, because it was very outwardly sexual. The piece is now understood as a problematic manifestation of the male gaze, in addition to being a bit unsubstantial and shallow. But it is still an outstanding part of the museum's collection. It's one of the Speed's most recognizable pieces. They sold magnets and posters of it for a very long time. So a few years ago, Miranda Lash, who is no longer, she's at MCA Denver now, but when she was at the Speed, she, as the contemporary curator, she chose to recontextualize this piece, and she did some research, and she found that the model, Eleanor Brown and Koch, was the daughter of Van Daren Koch, who was a photographer in Kentucky and a friend of Cassaire's. And when the painting was made, she was 2 years out of college, so she was a consenting adult. But there's some more context, because when Van Daren Koch died in 2004, Eleanor sued his estate over nude photos that he had taken of her as a young girl. So now there's a chance that she may have been exploited or coerced into modeling for John Cassaire, her father's friend. So in other words, she may have been groomed from a young age, and her modeling for that painting was not consensual. So Lash chose to recontextualize this piece with a new wall label that detailed the entire story of Eleanor Brown and Koch, her father, and Cassaire's misogyny and his gaze. So what if we presented Picasso in the same way that Lash had chose to present this painting, Light Purple Panties? What if we just took a moment and critiqued, say, Les Demoiselles d'Avignon, rather than celebrate it? What if we stopped calling him a genius and instead acknowledged that there was other work being done around him at the same time, including work by women, including work by Black, Indigenous, and Brown people, that simply did not get the same recognition because they did not have the same privilege as he did? What if we looked at the work that was being done by the women who were his models, because a lot of them were artists too? So it's really that simple, of just recontextualizing, letting the viewer come to their own conclusion. That is really the first step, and I think that is where like a broad change to an understanding of the canon will happen. It's really that simple, because again, the canon is not a monologue. There are stories waiting to be told that no one has looked into.
You know, it's interesting when you bring up like, you know, we've been talking in spaces about like the MoMA today, and like how they have Mademoiselle d'Avignon like on display there. And I think about how I've had some like pretty traumatic stories from like the MoMA, and just the way I've like witnessed people like interact art there. But you know, that painting is just like grouped around and like taken a million photos of, just as something, you know, like Starry Night is there or what have you. But yeah, I think that's a really great point about it falling back on the institution, and you know, what we always talk about, you know, holding the institution accountable. And I also don't think like cancel culture in general is something that's brought up within the work in museums as much as like we stimulate conversations about cancel cultures for the institution itself. But those conversations, I have not experienced them take place in museum settings by the museum so much.
I also just want to add to your point about, again, that lineage. I think whenever Gianna and I kind of have conversations with people about this, they say, oh, he did so much for, but Cubism, you know, to quote our favorite comedian, you know, they are so set on, like, they've been told repetitively that he built Cubism. You know, Brock maybe kind of entered his way in there, but I just want our listeners to know that, just as Anna said, for yourself, go look at the people who were making art at the same time as him. You know, go look at the lesser known artists and do research about people who are having the same thoughts about Cubist tendencies at the same time as him. Picasso did not build Cubism. We have been told that he did. And I also just wanted to quickly point out that Francoise Gillot was also an artist, and she has a book, and I was trying to look up the title of the book. I think it's called My Life with Picasso. I have yet to read it. It is on my wish list. Forgive me for bringing it up without having read it. But if you're interested further, I mean, look at his wives. Francoise Gillot was an amazing artist, and I just want to give her credit as well.
Anna, thank you so much for being here today. We're so excited to have you. Is there anything that you want to share or plug before you go? Where can our listeners find you? Obviously, we will link your TikTok because you guys have to go follow Anna's TikTok. It's truly where it's at.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me. I can't believe people watch my TikTok. I thought like 5 people were gonna see that. When I started this account, I was like, if 5 people watch my videos, I'll be happy. So I am I'm very flattered. My TikTok is still very much an ugly baby. I do yeah, I know what my voice is, but I haven't maybe articulated it yet. So I do really enjoy having that platform. Right now it's a way for me to explore visual art in a casual way. So if that's how you like to learn, please follow me. It's at but is it art, and it's like but_is_it_art. I post art history lessons, spicy takes, absurd memes. So I took a little bit of a break, but I'm picking up my book club again. So we're reading The Subversive Stitch right now. So if you are interested in art history, or just reading in general, if you just like to learn things through books, I post a chapter a week. We talk about it. We have conversations in the comments. You're welcome to stitch, duet, whatever you think, and join that discussion. With the pandemic getting under control and pending my 2nd dose of the vaccine, I will also be doing studio visits with artists soon. So if you are interested in especially the Louisville art scene, which is very cool, that is where I'll be documenting that. Some of the videos that we have mentioned in this episode, I have privated just because the comments have gone out of control. So if you are trying to find those videos, you might not find them right away, just FYI. But I'll make them public again once like the dust settles. Other than that, I'm a contributor for Ruckus, which is Louisville's independent arts journal. We are moving into the South and Midwest this year as well, so we'll be visiting other cities. If you live in the greater Louisville area, it's worth it to stay up to date with the art scene. Even if you don't live in Louisville, check it out because Kentucky is really cool. Ruckusjournal.org is the website, and it's free. Or if you want to support, you can also join their Patreon.
Cool. Yeah. We'll link all of that for you guys in our show notes. It'll be on our resources page. Anna, thank you so much for joining us. We can't wait to have you back. It was such a pleasure. Thank you for like enlightening all of us today.
Oh my God. Thank you so much for having me. I look forward to coming back.
Absolutely. Thanks so much.
Okay.
And with that, we'll talk to you guys on Tuesday. Bye, everyone.